Chelsea. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm doing another one of my catch-up wrap-ups, this time for December 2018. And this is still Esme, and she is still a floof. Yes, you are. Now, December was a really light reading month for me. I only read 4 books. They were all YA or middle grade. And one of those books was one of my 5-star TBR predictions. So I already wrapped that up in my 5-star TBR wrap-up. I will link you to that in case you missed it. So I only have 3 books to talk about here. They're books I read a long time ago. Hopefully this will be pretty quick. The first book I finished in December was The Black Cauldron by Lloyd Alexander, which is the second book in the Chronicles of Prydain, which is a very classic 5-book epic fantasy middle grade series. I was buddy reading these with Reija from the Bookfinch. I will link her channel down below, and basically neither of us have been liking this series at all. And for me, this book was even worse than the first. Mostly, I think, because it just feels really tedious and pointless and generic, but also because there were things that I found really aggravating in it. This series is inspired to an extent by Welsh mythology, which I'm not particularly familiar with. Maybe I'd get more out of it if I was able to see where that inspiration was coming from, I don't know. But mostly to me this just reads like very watered down, vaguely Tolkien-esque, epic doom and what does it mean to be a true hero stuff. The main character, Taran, is a young boy who's a classic, nobody orphan character who seems to probably have some big great destiny ahead of him. At least all of the adults in this book seem determined to see inherent virtues in Taran that I sure couldn't see what these inherent virtues in Taran were. He seemed completely undeserving of all of the faith that everyone around him has in him. I ended the first book, the Book of 3, feeling like I had been angry with Taran most of the book for being a jerk, but I was optimistic for the rest of the series because it seemed like the ending of that book really brought home how much of a jerk Taran had been, and oh, he's learned this lesson, he's going to be better now. Except that this book introduces another character who's a prince, and I've already forgotten his name. Anyways, a really haughty young prince who thinks Taran is, absolutely worthless scum because he's a pig keeper, an assistant pig keeper. He's not a prince. Basically, this character is designed to bring out the, defensive worst in Taran and vice versa, and they're at each other's throats throughout so much of the book. And the whole point of this seemed to be to basically undo all of that character development that Taran might have had at the end of book 1, and make him just as insufferable as he ever was. Basically what happens in this book is that a mission is put together to, go and destroy the Black Cauldron, which, even though a victory was achieved at the end of the big quest of book 1, is still a horrific threat in the hands of the baddies because the Black Cauldron can produce undead, evil warriors. And the leader of this expedition is the heroic Prince Gwydion, whom Taran idolizes, and who decides that Taran, being the, young hero in the making that he must be for this series to matter at all, gets to come along and participate. But the, part of this group that Taran is with is not on the front lines of the action. It's mostly all of the eccentric characters from book 1, What Do You Know? Plus a couple of new characters, including Eilonwy, the princess, who was not invited at all because she's a girl, who decides, because Lloyd Alexander clearly wants you to think he's written such a great, strong, rebellious female character, that she's going to tag along anyways and be mad at Taran for excluding her. Never mind that, all of the adults that actually planned this mission, including, Prince Gwydion, whom we're never supposed to question the judgment of, he is so wise, etc. The adults are the one who left her out of the mission and decided that Taran was going to be the young boy who was going to be, learning to be a hero. All that after Eilonwy was right about everything in book 1 and Taran was wrong. And so, because this series is about Taran, the mission doesn't go according to plan and everything ends up depending on Taryn's, band of eccentrics. And so Taryn ends up having a heck of a lot of responsibility and big decisions to make. Why do the full-blown adults here, one of whom I believe is at this point like literally the reigning monarch of a country, why do they all think Taryn should be in charge? I have no clue. This just pissed me off so much. It's just like repeatedly again and again and again, all of like the responsible adults giving Taryn the benefit of the doubt when he really doesn't deserve it. And like, we're supposed to think it's feminist because Eilonwy tags along without being invited? Anyhow, I gave this 1 star. I did not like it. It is not without like genuine nuggets of wisdom peppered throughout about what it means to be, heroic and selfless and do the right thing. I just have so little patience for this sort of stuff. And now I'm really torn on whether or not I continue with this series at all because they're such short books, and they're like classic fantasy, and I want to kind of know how the series ends. I feel like we're going to get some sort of big reveal about Taryn's origins and why he's important or something, and I kind of want to know what that is. But ooh boy, this was such a slog. I was reading this like on a train with a friend, and at a certain point she turned to me and said, "Kelsey, every like 30 seconds, you're closing that book, looking at the cover, and sighing." And I was like, oh dang, you're right, I am. Also, I've read the Goodreads reviews, and apparently book 3 is all about rescuing Eilonwy from something. Oof. So yes, I do own the rest of this series. At this point, I am in no hurry to continue on with them. Next was an older classic middle grade that I ended up listening to on audiobook, and that was The Witches by Roald Dahl, which I previously had no plans on reading in the month of December, except that something came up in my real life and I suddenly had a pressing, urgent need to know what the heck this book was about. And so the easiest way for me to just like cram it in over a weekend was to listen to it on audiobook, so I did. I think this was my first time reading Roald Dahl as an adult. This was one that I never read as a kid. I can see why. I am glad I never read it as a kid. It would have freaked me the heck out because this book is terrifying. On the other hand, like I can totally see from reading this, as, my first experience of Roald Dahl as an adult reader, why he is such a renowned classic author, because, oh my gosh, the writing is incredibly unique. Like, I did read some of Roald Dahl's books as a kid, but I had, kind of forgotten what that narrative voice was like, and it is so distinct. No one else writes like that. No one. So, A+ for the writing and the weirdness. But if I had to pass judgment on the actual story, I would have to say that I didn't really like it. It is really a very all-out, tell you a creepy, spooky story in order to freak you out type of book, which is not my thing. It wasn't my thing as a kid. It would have traumatized me as a child. I can handle it as an adult, though. It's about a boy who lives with his grandmother, and his grandmother tells him about witches, real witches, who are out to get little children because they hate little children so much. And witches in this book are not human. They are not human women. They are something else monstrous and terrifying, and they are only disguised as human women pretending to be nice little old ladies. And the main character ends up having an encounter with some witches who are turning children into mice. The main character does, in fact, spend much of the book as a mouse. And the ending is really, truly bizarre. So, not my cup of tea, but what an experience. I gave it 3 stars. I should note that the audio version I listened to, let me figure out who the narrator was, just a sec. The audio version was narrated by Miranda Richardson, and it was done with a bunch of special sound effects and stuff, and the atmosphere that created leaned very heavily into the scary story to spook the kiddos feel of the book, and I guess if you were wanting that sort of experience to play an audiobook like that for kids that was more of like a full soundscape experience, that might be, you know, like a good Halloween activity for the family, but as a reader, like, I really didn't need any of that. I also thought it was a strange casting choice to hire, like, an older woman to narrate a book that's told from a first-person point of view, from the perspective of a young boy. I usually have like a pet peeve where I see a lot of books narrated by men that I think should be narrated by women, and this is the only time I've ever like seen the reverse, where the choice to hire a woman to narrate this book made very little sense to me. She also didn't do very strong character voices for most of the characters in the book, which is fine with me. But then for, like, the leader of the witches, who has this huge chunk of dialogue in one scene, she went, like, all out, like, nails on the chalkboard type of voice, which is how it's described in the text, but it made it very, very hard to actually hear what she was saying. And part of me was like, okay, the narration already told me that this sounds horrific. You don't actually have to subject me to that for what must be, like, pages of text. And then the last book I have to talk about is Muse of Nightmares by Laini Taylor, which is the sequel to Strange the Dreamer and the final book in this duology. I had predicted upon finishing the first book, which was a 5-star read for me, that I probably wouldn't like the second book as much, given where the first book ended and the sort of sense that I got that this was going to be more like big epic action-y than the first one, and I think that was true. This was a 4-star read for me, but I still really liked it. And I also really like what this duology does as a whole. The first book was very slow, very character-driven. There were a lot of, like, sequences that took place in these crazy dreamscapes, which was very much my sort of thing. This is more like high-stakes stuff is happening, but I do really like the way this story is framed and put together in a way that feels like a really different type of epic fantasy. There is not a ton that I can say about the plot of this book without spoilers for book 1. But we are still following the two main characters from that book, Laszlo and Sarai. But we also have this other narrative that we're getting in spurts throughout that takes place prior to the events of this book, and in basically a completely different world. And eventually you learn how that backstory connects to what's going on here. I remember Laini Taylor talking quite a bit around the time this book was released about how one of her goals with this series was that she wanted it to be an epic fantasy where killing the villain wasn't going to solve any of the problems. Just doing away with the bad guy literally isn't a viable option. So what sort of story, what sort of narrative do you have then? And so while the stakes of this book are big and epic, there's, you know, some big scale stuff going on, it really feels like what's most important is the more personal storytelling, the more personal stakes. This is a story where basically a lot of the really bad, really horrifying, really traumatic stuff has happened in the past. And the whole story of this series is about finding a way towards forgiveness and towards moving on when some of those conflicts between characters who are just so set in their ways make conflict resolution seem impossible. This does take place in the same sort of multiverse as the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy, but in different worlds in that multiverse. And I think it really is interesting to compare those two series, because the Daughter of Smoke and Bone series did the thing where by the end it went to, like, the fate of the universes are hanging in the balance. And I feel like that can be a sort of trap with some of the sort of huge epic scale, like massive world building in fantasies, that you get that type of magical stakes that can be just so big that they're unrelatable. Here you have some of the same, like, world-spanning scope that makes, you know, it's so much fun to read Laini Taylor's gorgeously descriptive writing of all of these fantastical locales. And you do get the sense that, like, real large-scale devastating trauma has happened to inhabitants of multiple worlds here. But it's allowed to be that big and expansive while having more human stakes. So that's like the very loose ramble without going into any specifics about who the characters are or what is going on. Now, there are a couple of things that irk me a little in this book. At the end of the first book and throughout this one, Laszlo turns out to be sort of, you know, a bit more of a special chosen one than I had hoped for him when I started reading the series, and I really liked having a protagonist who seemed like such a normal person. There's also something that happens towards the end of this book that feels to me like just a plot mistake, and I want to believe that, like, maybe because this was an ARC copy, that's something that might have gotten caught, or that maybe I just misunderstood and something happened that I didn't catch. But there's a character in this book where it's very, very central to that character's storyline that he hasn't learned the language of the area where this book takes place, and so there's a language barrier between him and most of the other characters. And towards the end, when a certain group of characters have to all, like, work together and do a thing, that language barrier seems to completely disappear. Like, it didn't seem like anyone was translating for him. He was just having conversations with all of these people. And that just seemed like an error. So this wasn't a 5-star read for me like book 1 was, but I still liked it a lot. I gave it 4 stars. I would really love if Laini Taylor would keep writing series like this, maybe set in the same, you know, sort of humongous multiverse, but with sort of different types of stories. That would make me very happy. So that was it. That was the end of my December catch-up wrap-up. Let me know if you've read any of these books. Let me know what you think. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.